I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we have a very special guest.
We do. Author Yang Huang, who we've had on the show once before.
Back in 2018 for her collection of short stories, book, novel, kind of something in between a novel and a collection of short stories.
Yes.
My Old Faithful.
Yes, which I absolutely loved. We both really enjoyed for a lot of different reasons. These characters felt extremely familiar to me. One of Yang Huang's gifts as an author is being able to present characters who feel very, very, very real.
In a Chinese context.
Yeah, in a Chinese context. If you move to China tomorrow, 90% of the people you meet will feel like the people in Yang Huang's novels. These are people who've experienced a lot of challenge and just keep going, right? Her first collection of stories is about a family who has gone through the Cultural Revolution and is moving into modern China and is seeking the kinds of things that every family wants, right? To have good jobs, to be well-established, to thrive, etc. I loved reading it because it's one of the only novels I've ever read that deals with the Cultural Revolution as something that a family has gone through but doesn't live in forever, right? A lot of the novels that appear on the American market really try to suck all the drama out of the Cultural Revolution.
This is not scar literature.
This is not scar literature, no. So her current novel that we're talking with her about today, My Good Son, is in the same vein. You have wonderful lived-in characters.
Incredible attention to detail.
Wonderful attention to detail, yes. This is a single plot. It's a trio. That her first novel has a quartet. There's a son and a daughter. This one follows one single plot line. Yang, would you like to summarize that for us real quick?
Yes. First of all, I'm so flattered about your compliment, and I love your work. You taught me so much about Chinese literature, and I'm recommending to all my friends. My Good Son is a story about a Chinese father, Mr. Cai, who works as a tailor in Yangzhou, a provincial town. Mr. Cai wants his son Fan to become an engineer, but Fan has failed his college entrance exams 4 times, and this is his last chance. Meanwhile, a young American man named Jude comes to a tailor shop to have a vest made. Mr. Cai seizes the opportunity to ask Jude to be Fan's financial sponsor so that Fan can go to study at an American university. Of course, his plan backfires. Mr. Cai discovers that Jude is a gay man and needs help to come out to his estranged father.
Right. And it's such an interesting take on, Lee and I were talking right before this podcast, the story of a Chinese parent, very traditional parent, trying to provide for their child or children by effectively kind of pushing them into a life they don't really want to be in, is one that's been done quite a few times, but your take on it is very different. I have never seen a variation like this on this plot involving gender lines like this and sexuality. It's a really interesting take, and I was wondering, what made you think of this particular variation on this plot of having as a way of furthering the cause of his child, have him help a gay man come out to his father? What made you think of that?
Well, the story began with an image. I saw a tailor spend his entire life making clothes for other people. One day, he puts on a long form-fitting dress and walks in heels with difficulty. I didn't know what it meant, but the image stayed with me. So I tried to ask myself, does he pretend to be a woman, or is he driven by something else? I'm fascinated by how people work in the real world. A tailor reconciles his aspiration, artistic vision with the need to make a living. So I began to write a novel about a tailor and researched textiles and tailoring craft. I visit my parents and they introduced me to a tailor in Shanghai. This tailor had a son with a health problem. He told me that his petite wife had to carry the boy up 5 flights of stairs on her back after his treatment. Watching them made his heart burst with love, pain, and sorrow. I was deeply moved and decided to make my protagonist a father, struggling to raise his son up in this world. Because I saw the tailors wearing a dress, I knew there is a gay character central to the story. Initially, I tried to make Mr. Cai gay, but the story doesn't work. The gay man needs to be a foil and brings out something essential in Mr. Cai, evoking his sense of beauty, freedom, and integrity. So I created a white American gay man who brings the outside world to Mr. Tsai. In 1990, after Tiananmen Square protests, China began to open up to the world and pivoted to become economic superpower under autocratic regime. This was in the background. I wanted to focus the story on the individuals. So I created Jude and tried to get to know him, test him, and nurture him in the story. I suspect Fen is bisexual. In a way, Jude inspires Fen to explore his own sexuality when he goes abroad.
Can I ask, so the protagonist is named Feng Cai, which is a homophone for the word tailor. Was that, am I correct? Was that intentional or was that just subconscious?
I can't remember, but it might be both. I think Mrs. Hai just made a mistake by naming his son the profession that he doesn't want him to become. He tries to prevent him to become a tailor, but then he gives him a wrong name. So I thought that was ironic.
Yeah, so I thought that was a great kind of wink, nod to the Chinese speakers who are reading this, and I loved it. I was wondering, was there a larger kind of narrative in your use of the tailor character? So, when we were talking before the podcast, I mentioned that there is this long tradition in Western literature of the sort of tailor being the one who knits stories together. So I think Penelope and in the Odyssey knitting a quilt, and even the word in English, text and textile, are closely connected etymologically. Was that intentional on your part, or was that also subconscious?
I have not read the classic text you mentioned, but I'm so glad I came to the same metaphor. I just thought tailoring is a great metaphor because the tailor knows all your secrets. He knows your measurement and he knows what you try to do to camouflage your body's flaws. And so he's an artist trying to give you a second skin so you can look better to the world. I just thought that writers come to this metaphor at their own accord. And I'm very glad that my work fits into this tradition. It's a happy accident, I suppose.
And so you see the writer as a kind of tailor, kind of both hiding and accentuating the individual's attributes. Is that correct?
Everybody has a part, but the story is told just from Miss Tsai's perspective. The author really picks and chooses what he can and cannot see. This narrative is pretty much like tailoring. You stitch together a story that it's a very particular kind of journey forefathers to go through. So yeah, that's what I did.
I'm also curious, there are a lot of times in Chinese history you could have set this story, including the present. I'm curious why you chose the period right after the Tiananmen Square incident, because your first novel deals, at least in part, with the Cultural Revolution. Why did you decide to set it just after the Tiananmen Square protests?
This is a long story, but let me just try to give you the scope. So, Tiananmen Massacre changed the trajectory of Chinese history. The political reform, which had been underway before the protests, was vanquished after the massacre. You also mentioned in another podcast that imagine the train going at 85 miles per hour, just stopped dead in its track, never moved an inch, and was left to rust. This was what the democratic movement looked like after the massacre. But for the ordinary people, it had a profound influence. For Zhao, the university graduate who protested and saw some of the protesters being sent to the labor camp, women got raped, leaders were exiled. She knows there's no way to carry on the revolution. Just let it be the elephant in the room, something you can never talk about again. For Mr. Tsai, who didn't see the protest, it was something rather remote. For Fen, he unwittingly benefited from this movement because the whole world was sympathetic toward Chinese intellectual after the massacre. Many countries relaxed their immigration policies. I came to the States in 1990. Before that, it was nearly impossible for young people to come and study. The immigration officer needed the proof that you have children and parents in China so that you will return after your studies. After 1989, U.S. immigration allowed unmarried students to come and study. So this changed my life and also Fen's life. The massacre was a defining moment of my life in many ways. It was my responsibility to write it into my stories. The characters were affected deeply in invisible ways, like an elephant in the room, psychologically and spiritually. But politics does not dictate their lives. People are active agents of their future. They're busy with real goals, make a living, raise good children, and take care of their family members. People want to live with dignity and hope, not waste away on things that have no control. These are the real people you see in China, not dissidents or revolutionaries who are either underground or in the prison.
So was it intentional on your part to depict characters who had been through these events but were not going to dwell on them, or was that sort of accidental?
It's my intention because this is real. That's what real people, and that's the only way to go forward. Nobody wants to live in some great tragedy that they are not at fault and they have no control. So they want to make their lives better by doing the things that they have control over. And that's what these people do.
One other question I had with the novel, so you set up a sort of parallelism. The Chinese father-son pair, the father is disappointed in the son because of his failure academically. In the American father-son pair, the father is disappointed because the father is a Southern Baptist, very traditional conservative, and the son turns out to be gay. And that parallelism and friction drive much of the plot. Could you talk a little bit more about how you came to that sort of those two parallel father-son pairs and how it drives things?
I just wanted to depict the family relationship in two different cultural contexts. They love their children, but they don't like them very much. They don't get along. And it's the same everywhere. It's in China, it's in America. They're different people because all people are different, right? Because you're in a family and you cannot be disinterested bystanders. You cannot leave them alone. And the bond between parent and child is one of the few relationships in society that's not at heart transactional. In the work world, everyone's in some way dispensable, but no one's dispensable in their own family, no matter how fraught the parent-child relationship is. Everybody overcompensates a little and they make mistakes. I just want to show that very honestly, and also give a little bit of humor.
And it's interesting because, and I don't know if this was intentional. I'd be curious to hear if it was. I don't know that we could say the Chinese parents' prioritizing of career for child is the same thing as a very religious American parent's emphasis on religion is for their child, but it's not too dissimilar. And was that intentional to put those two together to suggest to the Western reader, this is how intense this need for a Chinese parent to have their child succeed is?
Yes. I want to choose the things that really tick people off, that are very important in their own culture. So that's what I choose. I guess we can all do better. Try harder.
And I think that's a really neat point. Lee and I were talking about before the podcast how the novel is an interesting mix of things that I think Chinese readers will particularly understand, Western readers not necessarily so. But that's why the father-son pairing on the American side is so important, because it gives American readers a window onto, oh, this is how big a deal this is for Chinese parents. And I was curious too, one of the things that really stuck out to me is that in the context of the story, Mr. Tsai's desire for his son to go study in America is presented as an option. Was this meant to be just one option among many, or was this meant to be the greatest possible thing that could happen to his son?
At the time, it was one of the options. But as you think harder on what it actually means, that Fan can pursue tailoring without looking like a failure, because in China it's a job. Fan will have more options, have a freer life, then it becomes a great accomplishment. And at the beginning of the book, he says he just wants his son to live his own life, be responsible for his success or failure. And this is really going above and beyond. He really is responsible for himself. He cannot fall back on his parents. He has to grow up. So this is more than what he bargains for, but it's just, it's a great accomplishment.
One of the questions I had for you is, how do you see yourself in your novel? So this is a novel written in English. You're focusing on an American audience. For me, it felt like reading Chinese literature in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
How do you see yourself positioned in terms of Chinese literature? Do you have a particular writer or tradition that you kind of think of yourself in relation to?
I think I have become a member of the Chinese American authors. My tradition is with writers like Ha Jing, Yuan Li, and Qi Ming, and all these great Chinese American authors. But more important, I just want to tell stories, my own stories, and authentic Asian American stories. I think authentic storytelling is so important because our capacity to understand what is going on in someone else, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with them or not, is a path to peace. And it's just essential quality to understand people who don't look like you, but they're just as human as you are. And we have a lot of work to do now that Asian American authors are becoming more successful and visible, garnering major awards. I'm very proud to be part of this literary community.
As well, you should be. I think it's, what I will say too is, for those listening to the podcast, one of the things that should make you want to read Yang Huang's books is that when she says that she is interested in stories and characters, her characters really feel like real people.
They're authentic.
Very authentic. This does not read like a novel written by someone who simply wants people to read a China story. This is written by someone who really wants good characters to shine through. And so the entire novel really is these two families. And there is a neighbor to Mr. Tsai's who is also part of the story. But of course the core is these father-son pairings. I'm reminded of the novel Fathers and Sons by Turgenev, which is a similar thing where there's a lot of political turmoil, but really the entire novel is just father-son, these two father-son pairings. And it's such a wonderful read for that very reason. You will find things you relate to in this story, just in every chapter practically.
Thank you for saying that.
And thank you for agreeing to talk with us. I think we'll start wrapping it up here. Is there anything in particular you wanted to leave the listener with before we get ready to sign off?
I have 2 book readings. Can I mention them?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
On June 7th, I have an Odd Mondays reading at Folio, and my virtual book launch is on June 9th at Booksmith. The events are free, and you need to register to get the Zoom links. I'll be in conversation with Caitlin Solomini. I hope you enjoyed this story and see a bit of yourself in the characters.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so definitely try to attend those events. Definitely get the book. Lee and I were very, very fortunate to get ours sent to us, and that's been one of the best things about having a podcast like this is getting to read great stories like this. So, Yang, once again, thank you so much for being with us. Cannot recommend this book highly enough to our listeners. Definitely check it out, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rob and Lee, for your wonderful work.
Thank you so much again. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.